right. Hello and good day, everyone. My name is Lindsay McNair, and I will be the moderator of our webinar today. I am a physician and research ethicist, and I've worked in drug development and clinical trials for more than 25 years. I am also a member of the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, which we refer to as CUPA, which is housed in the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine in New York City. A link to CUPA's webpage is being put into the chat if you'd like to see more information on the group. CUPA's mission is to advance research, policy, and education regarding the ethical issues surrounding access to investigational medical products. In keeping with the educational portion of that mission, CUPA annually hosts a webinar geared to those new to the topics of expanded access, pre-approval access, right to try, and associated issues. This year, CUPA is experimenting with the, quote, flipped classroom format, meaning that all of you as registrants were asked to watch the pre-recorded presentation about expanded access, and today's webinar is a forum for you to ask questions of experts from the CUPA Working Group. You can submit your questions to us at any time via the Q&A function that you see on your screen. Please don't put questions into the chat discussion because we can't watch them coming in at both places at the same time. Remember that today's event required no advanced knowledge beyond watching that recorded video, so there are no stupid questions. Please feel free to ask anything and also ask us if you need clarification about acronyms or terminology. If you just have a quick definitional question, you can put that in the chat and a member of the CUPA team will respond to that. But if you have a question for our experts, please put those into the Q&A box. CUPA also has a detailed frequently asked question and FAQ list on its website. This is our first time trying this flipped classroom approach, so we will send you a survey afterwards asking for your feedback and your thoughts. And now I'd like to introduce our CUPA experts panel for today. Presented in alphabetical order, we have Dr. Jinsy Andrews, Associate Professor of Neurology and Columbia University's Division of Neuromuscular Medicine, and the Director of Neuromuscular Clinical Trials in the Department of Neurology. Claudia Hirawat, the owner and executive chair of Voz Advisors. Before founding Voz in 2015, Claudia was the president of PTC Therapeutics Incorporated. Richard Klein, the director of Expanded Access Programs and Policy for the GE2P2 Global Foundation. Richard worked at the FDA for more than 40 years before leaving the agency in 2017. And last but not least, Mary Elizabeth Williams, a doctoral candidate of medicine humanities, a journalist, and an author. Mary Elizabeth is a survivor of metastatic melanoma. She participated in a phase 1 immunotherapy clinical trial, an experience which she chronicled in her Alvarez Award-winning science memoir, A Series of Catastrophes and Miracles, which I highly recommend. It's a great book. So with this panel of experts from a variety of backgrounds, we are ready for any question that you can throw at us. And we have participants from a variety of backgrounds with us today as well. We have participants from biopharma teams, from industry, we have care providers, we have IRB staff and IRB members, and we have a lot of patients and caregivers and patient advocates with us today too. So please feel free to start entering those questions into the Q&A screen. And we're going to start with some of the questions that actually came in through the registration process. So the first question, and I'm going to direct this at Jinsy, is how do patients find out about products that are available via expanded access or right to try? And then Richard, I'll ask you for your thoughts on that as well after Jinsy.
Yeah. So my background, for those of you that don't know, I'm a neurologist who specializes in ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, and there is no treatment or cure that can halt disease progression, and it is a terminal diagnosis. So often there is very common asks about investigational therapies and ways to access them, most commonly through clinical trials. Typically, for expanded access to a right to try, the conversation does begin with the healthcare provider or the doctor or the team. And typically the doctor will or may have some knowledge of what could be available or what might be the development pipeline. Sometimes it is the foundations that support those diseases. They may have knowledge as well. and may have databases. Now, traditionally, I saw one of the questions there about if the doctor doesn't know, then how can I find out for my illness? And that is a very good question and a difficult challenge across all disease states, because the access to that information can be variable from location to location and doctor by doctor. Traditionally, clinicaltrials.gov is a website that houses, especially in the United States, the clinical trials, but also has some programs, although not all expanded access programs exist in that. There is another database which is less frequently discussed, and I think in my approach in talking with people and trying to find out other resources, there is another database that's held by the Reagan-Udall Foundation as an expanded access navigator. I don't have a lot of experience using it because we do, I should also disclose that I chair the clinical trial consortium. So we try to keep track of these things in ALS. And so the ALS Clinical Trial Consortium works with foundations to try to keep a clinical trial database and an expanded access page. And we also work with other organizations like IMALS, who also tries to provide databases for expanded access programs. But those are the two that I know of. I don't know if anyone else has any others, and maybe I can toss it over to Richard.
Yeah, I think clinicaltrials.gov is an excellent place to start after, as you pointed out, Jinsey, talking to your physician, because your physician probably knows your condition very well and hopefully is up on, what's in development and what's available and what clinical trials are being conducted. But clinicaltrials.gov has an advanced search engine that you can use. So when you get on the page, you can just scroll down and you can click off for expanded access. You can look for particular products by drug name. You can look at particular conditions, and you can look at geographic regions of the country. If a company has an open expanded access program, they're required to list it in clinicaltrials.gov, so it should be there. But if companies do not have an existing program, that doesn't mean it's impossible to get access from that company. So if there's no expanded access program listed, it is useful sometimes to contact the company and request that and see if they're open to providing it for a particular therapeutic approach.
Thank you, Richard. Mary Elizabeth, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I just want to throw in the patient and caregiver perspective that I think clinicaltrials.gov, I think of it as my nemesis. I think it is really, really confusing. It is not written in patient-friendly language. It is pretty much the only game in town. That doesn't make it a good game. And when you are facing a diagnosis for yourself, for your child, for a parent, for someone you love, and you are overwhelmed with all the information being fire hosed at you from your clinicians, it is a very, very difficult to navigate site. It is very difficult to get clear information. I wish there were more resources, but I think we should be transparent about the fact that it is not user-friendly, and it is very hard to pull out from that the information that might actually help you. If you are fortunate enough to be in a good dialogue with your clinicians, that's a great place for you to look together and start coming up with ideas, if you're lucky enough to have clinicians who are open to that. But I just want to let people know, it is extremely frustrating for people who are not researchers to look at and navigate.
One other point is that companies are supposed to be listing their policies on expanded access on their website. So if you're familiar with a particular therapeutic approach that you are interested in, then it is useful to look at that company website as well.
And Richard, Claudia, I see your hand up and I will come to you, but Richard, I just wanted to mention that requirement for companies to list their policy on their website came from the 21st Century Cures Act, if I remember correctly. Is there any enforcement from that act for companies that have not caught up with that requirement and aren't providing that information?
I'm not actually aware of any real enforcement. I think they'll get a letter reminding them that they're supposed to be doing that, but I don't think there's like a strong-toothed enforcement that was ever written into that law.
And peer pressure from groups like CUPA, I hope. Claudia, did you want to add something to the initial question? You're muted, Claudia.
Thank you.
Yep.
I think when you are facing a difficult health condition, you should make every effort to connect with a patient advocacy group for a number of reasons in terms of the support that you get, the experience that you can learn from, but also this particular instance, they know about pre-approval drug access opportunities before they are discussed very broadly. Usually they are the ones that advocate for it. So I just want to both highlight the power that patient groups have in reaching out to companies and saying, what are your plans for this type of access? And the opportunity for patients to many times find much more digestible information through a patient group.
Or someone who can help them digest that information. Yeah,
Yes,
I
there's
think
usually
that's a great
someone
point.
there that they can talk to.
Jinsey, anything else before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, just tightly to wrap up Mary Elizabeth's comments and Claudia's comments. Very true that it's very difficult to navigate clinicaltrials.gov. It's very true that foundations are a great source sometimes to start with for support in various ways. And I will say, using that as an example, which we've actually experienced in the ALS world, we have partnered with foundations to develop a clinical trial database that takes information and kind of makes it easier to navigate through and easier to understand and digest. So we have a clinical trial database navigator that we're working with, ALS TDI, for example, and all the groups kind of work together to kind of curate it so it's easier for people to use. So definitely strong points.
Great, thank you. Richard, I'm going to come to you for the next question, which is more of a regulatory question that has to do with the process of submitting a treatment IND or an application to FDA for single patient expanded access. Can you clarify who that submission to the FDA needs to come from? Is it coming from the manufacturer? Is it coming from the patient? Who submits that?
Actually, it should be the physician who submits that request. And you had mentioned the treatment IND and individual access, and they're actually technically two different things. A treatment IND would be established by the sponsor, and then the physician would make a request to the sponsor to enter into that treatment IND, which is a large-scale, broad access program. But for an individual patient, it needs to come from the physician to FDA with a letter of authorization from the company, saying that the company is able and willing to provide the product. So it starts with the physician asking the company for access, and then that application comes to FDA.
Thank you. And not slightly related question, what about use of an agent that is approved for one indication, but someone is interested in trying to use it potentially through expanded access for a second indication? Can you talk a little bit about off-label use versus expanded access?
Sure. If a product is already approved for any indication, so it has a labeled indication, a physician can, under the practice of medicine, which is not regulated by FDA but by the states, can prescribe that product for any condition that they see appropriate. So off-label, it means just prescribing the product outside of the labeled indication that it was approved for and studied for. So there are certain products that are well known to be applicable for other indications, but if a company has not actually done a clinical trial to show that it is safe and effective for that, it wouldn't get onto the label.
Thank you. And before we go to the next question, just a reminder to anyone who joined us late, if you have a question for our experts, please put it into the Q&A box. We can't track both the questions coming in and the chat at the same time, so we'll be watching for questions that come into Q&A. Jinsey, did you want to add something to that before we go to the next question?
Yes. So as a physician, the off-label prescription is something that when you're sitting as a physician and someone's requesting it, you talk about the risks and benefits. There is no consent form or sort of approval process, but what I will only add is that In my experience, sometimes these are covered by a patient's insurance. Sometimes they are not because they're being prescribed and the person who I prescribed it for does not have the indication that it was FDA approved for. So that's one of the risks when you talk about off-label prescribing or repurposing an already approved drug through the FDA for another purpose.
Good point. Thank you very much. So another question that came in through the registration process, and this has a little bit of a background with it as well. This is from someone who said that they secured expanded access to an investigational drug. They went through the FDA authorization process, IRB approval, access to the drug, all the regulatory and logistical barriers. And then after waiting for months, they were told that the hospital would not move forward due to institutional policy. Their question is, what steps can institutions take to ensure that expanded access isn't just technically possible, but that the process is actually transparent and one that patients know how to navigate, so no one is spending precious time unsure what's happening or what's possible or what their options are? Anybody want to be the first to take that? That's a tough one.
I think I can start
Great.
because in neurological diseases, there's a wide variety of therapies and targets and routes of administration. And what I will say is that if the drug company would like to provide it through expanded access, it gets FDA approval for providing it via expanded access. It then needs institutional review board review. And that is a hurdle from the physician's side and the team side. But there are secondary reviews that occur, especially at academic institutions, when they look at what type of therapy is being provided and what level of risk and what resources will be used. And so typically there are clinical research kind of entities besides the IRB that can look at these things to ensure that I'm not trying to take a risky therapy with no scientific rationale, because the IRB's purview, the review boards, the ethics review boards are looking for ethical conduct and compliance with federal regulations, making sure a person's rights are protected and confidentiality is protected. But there are other kind of issues that are involved. And so hospitals, and this is one of the hardest things because sometimes it is not so transparent. I definitely ran into this situation myself. And although I was really wanting it, the person living with the disease wanted it. They raised issues about the funding for the actual procedure. So this was to use stem cell therapy. And we would have to use specialties outside of neurology. So I had to collaborate with the hematology oncology. I had to collaborate with the cell therapy lab, and all of these people need funding to do the work that's required to provide the expanded access. So the more complicated it is, and the more complicated the route of administration for, in this case, I needed to manage a bone marrow biopsy and also a spinal tap to give the infusion and kind of do it on multiple occasions. It's a high cost, high risk procedure utilizing multiple resources. And I did get stopped for consideration about how sure are we that this is going to work? And that was the question that was raised and ultimately used to kind of halt the progress.
Thank you, Jinsei. That's a really illustrative anecdote that really talks about the practical challenges of some of these processes. In talking about the complications of the number of parties that may need to be involved, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the financial aspects of expanded access. Richard, from a regulatory point of view, can you talk a little bit about whether manufacturers can charge for expanded access to the drug and whether you actually see that happen, and how that might also apply to right to try if people go through the right to try pathway rather than expanded access?
Yeah, it's very rare that a sponsor will charge for access to an investigational product under an expanded access program, but there is a pathway in the FDA regulations to permit that, but it is limited to the cost of manufacturing the drug that will be administered to the patient. It can't include things like background research. It can only be the cost of making and providing that drug. So it can include things like shipping. If you have a larger program, an intermediate sized patient population or a treatment IND, you can also be charging patients for administrative costs that are involved. Because there are costs involved in administering the program, maybe having an 800 number and all of the logistical aspects that go to making that drug available. But it's required that in the FDA regulations, there is a certified public accountant who audits the cost of what that should be and submits it to the agency for review. But in right to try, that last component is not part of the access. So although they are required to have the same kind of limitation on the price, there's not really a verification process as there is on the FDA pathway.
Thank you. And then, Jinsy, this might be a question for you. What about the associated costs of actually getting the product? I mean, there may be blood tests, there may be radiology scans, there may be all of those things that also need to be covered.
Yeah, I think that's a very good and critical question, because often people will just focus on what the cost of the investigational product is, but depending on what resources are needed, there are some methods in which you could charge if it's part of regular standard clinical care. Like if I need a blood count and I'm going to do it anyway on this patient, then I'm going to order it and it's covered by insurance. But if I'm, typically in my patient population, they don't need bone marrow biopsies. So if I'm going to send them for that, insurance will not cover it, and that'll be a cost. And either to make it happen, money has to cover it. So that could come from the sponsor, or it becomes an out-of-pocket expense for the person receiving the treatment. And then that's where it becomes complicated.
Yeah. Claudia, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just today we're focused in the US portion of this, but I just want to point out that outside of the US, there are countries that allow for charging for access to a drug very close to what their commercial price is intended to be. And it's a mechanism that especially young companies utilize to help fund programs, globally. And that one of the restrictions for US companies, I think, is this idea that you disclose cost puts them in a very vulnerable position in terms of describing all the costs associated with what does it really take to get a drug in the market, and then may influence pricing decisions down the line. So it's not really looked at as a favorable thing to be engaged in.
Thank you, Claudia. So a question that looks at kind of the manufacturer perspective on this. We've talked a little bit about the idea that people can request expanded access from a manufacturer, but the manufacturer doesn't have to provide it. And they may have valid reasons for not being able to provide expanded access. The question that came in through the registration process is, what structural changes, whether they are changes in policy or incentives, can help make compassionate use more equitable and can help encourage companies to say yes when there are patients who have unmet medical needs? Claudia, do you want to start with that from the sponsor perspective? And then I'm going to ask Mary Elizabeth about the patient perspective.
Yes, thank you. I think structurally is not really the place that I would go to. I would go to awareness. So certainly if you have a severe condition, you're monitoring the pipeline very closely, you see programs entering into development, you are working with a patient group to reach out to companies early on and say, what is your plan for any form of pre-approval drug access? Are you considering it? It is not right for every drug being developed. The answer it's not always yes, but to have that conversation as early as possible and to ask for consideration. I like to say that if you're developing a drug and no one is clamoring for it, maybe you shouldn't be developing it because there's no demand, and that's a red flag to me. But there are a lot of constraints, especially small companies face, including simple things like the actual availability of the drug product, where financially they're able to make just enough for the clinical trial, or having such a rare disease that they really need every single patient to qualify for the trial, and they don't have the resources to go after the patients who may be outliers. So I think it's just the awareness and the dialogue as early as possible. I believe that every company should have a strategy for access, although I don't think it's necessarily true that every company should pursue some form of pre-approval drug access.
That's a great point. And I have worked with companies that were developing drugs in very rare diseases where literally every milligram of drug that they could manufacture was, calculated into how they could do the clinical trial. And they literally had no more to be able to use. Mary Elizabeth, is there anything else you want to add to that from the patient perspective?
Yeah, just, one thing that Claudia said that I think is true, but I also want to point out the corollary of is sometimes we are not hearing the demand, or we're not seeing people beating the drums the loudest, because those are the people who are the most vulnerable, who don't have the resources, so all you have to do is look at the attention that we give to breast cancer. Breast cancer is a disease that has a very strong community behind it, has a lot of people who are motivated, has people who have time and energy and effort. You look at other conditions, other diseases, and it's dead silence. And that's not always because there isn't a community, it's because that community just doesn't have the resources. So that's something else we need to be thinking about. And the fact that the vast majority, overwhelming majority of clinical trials never get to approval, die in research, die before they even get off the ground, should be incentivizing drug development companies, should be incentivizing the pharmaceutical company to be thinking more creatively about how they want to recruit patients. And that is something that just still frustrates me to death, that is not really being done at a level that I think is really doing service to the patient community, and frankly is costing the pharmaceutical industry billions of dollars every year that could be better spent.
Well, there are a lot of strategic advantages from conducting these programs too. They bring in a lot of value to the development program, even into the fine-tuning of the research strategy and having real-world data. So those shouldn't be ignored. It is not just doing something because it's the right thing to do. I think there are valid business questions in play, and that companies will do well to analyze the suitability of these programs into their bigger development strategy.
One other point is that FDA has no authority to mandate that a company provide expanded access, but many times I've seen the review divisions will be looking at data that looks very positive in early studies when there are unmet medical needs for a population, and encourage companies to consider expanded access programs.
It's a great point. Thank you. And thank you, Mary Elizabeth and Claudia. A question that has come in through the portal, and Richard, you may be the one to address this first. What are the obligations of a manufacturer to patients who have been provided with early access treatment or expanded access treatment, and then the drug does not get FDA approved? And that the answer is probably different when we're talking about single patient access versus intermediate or large size patient access. But Richard, do you want to take that one first?
Well, so you're talking about people who are in expanded access as opposed to clinical trials?
People who are in expanded access and then the drug doesn't get all the way to approval and never becomes commercially available.
Yeah, sometimes the company will simply exit the access program and stop manufacturing or providing the drug. Other times they will continue. FDA, particularly if there are people who say or experience positive benefit from the therapy, and the company is willing, they can continue the access program even though they're not currently developing the product.
And I think that answer is very similar to what happens in clinical trials too. If you have a
Mhm.
trial going on and it's clear that the drug is not going to go to approval, if the company has drug available that they can use, they may be willing to provide it through an open access pathway. But often since they're going to stop manufacturing the drug, that becomes practically impossible to do.
Yeah, over
Because
the
they're
long
not going to
term.
continue to do manufacturing runs and stability testing
Mhm.
for a drug that they now know is never going to go for marketing approval. Claudia, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think depends a lot on the reason why the trial stopping. If it's demonstrated that it really has no path forward in terms of efficacy or safety, then an appropriate discontinuation can be done somewhat quickly. If, and this is often the case, it's more of a gray area. We work often with companies to determine what that strategy is, and there are plenty of examples of expanded access trials or expanded access programs that led to the continuing acquiring of drug and then became an instrument for revisiting with FDA that led to an approval. So there is this other circumstance as well where maintaining the drug on the people who are benefiting from it, even if it's not completely clear, but being able to get that additional data that tips the scale, it really what saves the therapy. There's a recent example in Prader-Willi, which is really, really important.
Great point. Thank you. Next question, and Jinsey, I think you may be the person we'll start with on this one. This is a tricky one. How would you propose overcoming the barriers to expanded access in personalized medicine? So if we're talking about things like CAR T therapy, which are directed at individual patients, is that even something for which expanded access, when you have to manufacture the drug for each person, is possible?
I think that's like, and of course, I know this whole panel can make a comment on this. There's a lot of factors that go into personalized medicine, CAR T, or even gene specific or gene mutation specific experimental therapies that are targeting diseases. And I think one of the things that make it easier, in my experience, is that when it is a rare condition or a population that's very small, sometimes we have some rationale to use the expanded access pathway to create either a therapy that's very specific for a gene mutation or a cell therapy that's very specific for a small population. I think sometimes we have a little bit easier time, and I've certainly been with teams that have done that. Both in ALS and for mitochondrial diseases, where we use the expanded access pathway first and for a select number of individuals. And then from there, moved on to a pivotal. We did a series of them and then did a pivotal, or working on a pivotal study. What I will say is one of the challenges is that in both scenarios, there was a drug company willing to help with the manufacturing. So that's one of the biggest hurdles, I think, is actually having a company that's willing to work either with the physician or the academic center. The second is trying to create a means by which we have enough data to give it to a person, right? So we have to make sure that there is some toxicology data that meets the threshold for FDA allowing us to do expanded access. So that's the preclinical animal studies sometimes to kind of get the base minimum, but they call it acute toxicology. The next challenge is really getting it into the clinic and into a person. And that as simple as it sounds, but funding is very important. How you get the funding to support the dosing. So it's not just the funding for the manufacturer to manufacture, and also get the studies done in the preclinical studies to allow us to dose human beings, but also once it's there, how do we cover the cost to give it to somebody and monitor their safety? So I think the bottom line from my perspective sometimes is always the resources, the financial resources to cover all of those costs.
Thank you. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and Claudia, this kind of comes back to something you touched on in giving your earlier answer before, but we've had a couple questions asking this more directly. what is the potential benefit to a manufacturer, a biopharma company, a sponsor, for providing their product? And let's assume it's for free, because as Richard said, most companies may have the ability to charge for cost recovery, but don't use that. So it's not income. What is the business case for a company to want to provide their product for free via either expanded access or right to try? It's going to cost them money to do. What is the potential benefit to them of doing that?
There is reputational opportunity there in terms of your relationship with the community and you making an effort, even if it's not the broadest effort. We've had clients who've done some very limited but very meaningful pre-approval access in gene therapy, and they felt it was important that they couldn't do dozens of patients, but they could do a few, and they felt it was important to do it, and the patient group was very appreciative of that effort. The knowledge of the drug, especially in more of a real world scenario, understanding how it impacts patients, the experience that they have with it, familiarizing the community and physicians with that therapy. That's always an element of good commercialization planning, having people know about it and sort of support the idea that this is desirable and demonstrate that it was desirable, that people wanted to be on it. I had a client approach me last week. They have an expanded access program in place, but they haven't had anyone sign up for it. And I think that tells you a lot, right? Why are you not engaging on it? So I think the demonstrating demand as a company, talk about it with its investors, with the community in general, are positive things. And of course, there are those examples I mentioned where the data was just so powerful that they directly supported or drove the approval of the drug. So yes, there are a lot of good reasons.
Thank you. Mary Elizabeth, you were nodding quite a bit as Claudia was speaking. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I'm just going to put my journalist hat on for a moment and say I don't think it's any big news to anyone that the industry has a big reputational problem right now, and that we live in an era of misinformation, disinformation, and a great deal of skepticism and fear around drug development and research. Anything that can be done to mitigate that is really, really important. That is, I never try to appeal to anybody's altruism. That is just money in the bank for a company. Anything you can do to improve the reputation of the industry, I think, is really, really important. And anything you can do to demonstrate that kind of good faith. And as you also mentioned, Claudia, this is the path to fast tracking and getting things that actually get through the process of drug development, which is money in the bank as well. It's so much more cost effective to get drugs that actually get developed, right? It's a savings of billions of dollars potentially a year. And I think both of those things alone are worth it.
Thank you, Mary Elizabeth. Richard, a regulatory question for you. What is the typical turnaround time from the point of submission to the FDA of an expanded access request to when that product can actually be administered to the patient? And there are several components to that timeline, not all of which have to do with the FDA, but let's start with that part.
Well, the FDA technically has 30 days to review an application. So it could take as long as 30 days, but it rarely does. Usually a division puts a lot of emphasis and priority on requests for expanded access so they can turn around in a matter of days. FDA has an extremely good track record in turnaround and allowing these programs to go forward. So the last time I looked at was about 99.6% are allowed to go forward. Sometimes there are safety issues or patients who don't really seem to qualify for access. But for the most part, they're turned around very quickly. There are also emergency IND requests that come in. There's a center at FDA that's open 24 hours, 7 days a week. They take those calls. They have access to review divisions who will turn that around within a couple of hours.
And I've seen that happen personally with people literally getting an IND number on the phone
Mhm.
and speaking with someone at FDA so that I think it took 2 hours for them to get the IND number so that they could keep
Yeah,
moving forward.
people put a very high priority on the
Yeah.
access programs.
Yeah. And then, of course, between that and actually administering to the patient, there are other steps in the process. There's
Right.
the
So
approval
that,
process.
that raises a very good point that there can be a lot of logistical questions of shipping, labeling, supply chain monitoring, keeping
Right.
the product cool if it has to be cool, or
Yeah.
working with the pharmacy at a hospital or a physician who's going to administer that product. So, and the IRB review is another issue that can delay the actual access.
And that leads nicely into another question, which was actually directed at Jinsey, which was you mentioned that in trying to navigate this process for a patient in the past, you had hurdles in the IRB review process. I know some of our registrants today were IRB members and IRB staff, and this question may have come from one of them, but can you talk a little bit about what the hurdles were that you experienced during the IRB review?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge sometimes is when a request comes for a drug that has not actually completed a lot of safety testing or has very minimal or scant phase 1 data. So it comes down to the risk benefit assessment and questions that come back, and it's fair questions because the IRB members are not ALS specialists or a specialist in the disease that the request is being made. So if the therapy potentially carries very large risks or risks that can disable somebody, even if it's in a terminal situation, what is the rationale and what do we know about the drug and why are we taking those risks? And it does take additional, and once I provide sometimes these explanations and compare it to the risk of whatever disease that we're working with, we sometimes get to that point, but it does require this back and forth conversation about the disease itself, perhaps sometimes about the investigational product, why it's being asked for, and what has already been exhausted from the person living with the disease and their perspective. So it's not always readily an easy decision for any committee to make.
I think another important point when it comes to IRBs is that it's very, very important for patients to either have an informed consent or an assent for children or people with certain cognitive disabilities. It is the responsibility of the IRB to make sure that those informed consents fully inform the person that this is an experimental product, that there may be risks that are unknown. What are the risks that are known? What are the potential benefits that may derive from the use of this product? But I think it's a very important point to have the IRB on top of the informed consent.
And when I talk about hurdles, I don't talk just about IRB. Once we get that approval, it's about, trying to make sure the logistical components, these drugs don't just come to my clinic and sit there for me to give. It has to go to a research pharmacy where it abides by all the rules of storage or reconstitution. They have to review the protocol and dosage handling, and they have to agree to do it, or they have to have the capability to do it. Sometimes that's not
Right.
possible in some
They may need a
institutions.
-80
Right.
freezer. They may need.
Right. And so there are things that kind of need to be done. And although it's expanded access, it's meant to be given rapidly. Sometimes in certain situations, we try to do it as fast as possible. It just doesn't seem fast enough.
Yeah.
And there are times when we're dealing with a situation, I think this relates to another question, where it is just extremely urgent. And those one-off cases, I do want to make sure I emphasize that there are mechanisms within institutions and hospitals that if it's an extremely urgent, life-threatening issue, there are mechanisms to kind of get a designated person for that entity, for the research pharmacy, for the clinical research unit, for the IRB, and the physician to kind of meet quickly to have an expedited review. But it has to meet that criteria of that urgency or an emergency.
Also, if there's international involvement and products have to move across borders, there can be delays related to customs examinations and legal ramifications of moving across international borders.
That's a great point. Yeah. Yep. A question about clinicaltrials.gov. Who is responsible for posting information on clinicaltrials.gov about expanded access programs? Is it the manufacturer or is it the physician?
It would be the manufacturer or the sponsor, and the physician could be a sponsor, but generally you have to be registered with clinicaltrials.gov as a sponsor in order to post on the site, and so it's the sponsor.
So generally, we would see this coming from the company that is saying, we are willing to make this product available for
Yes.
expanded access,
Mhm.
and not from an individual physician who has requested the product for expanded access.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. A question that is perhaps a little bit timely and might require a little bit of prediction. And maybe Richard, you may be the first to answer this one as well. What do you think may happen to expanded access and right to try under the current administration over the next 3 to 4 years? Do you see any changes in policy coming? Do you see any changes in emphasis coming?
I don't foresee changes on the FDA policy. I know that right to try is something that constantly is evolving because different states are passing different legislation. And as we saw in the past, those state legislation can influence national legislation. I know that the administration is invested in right to try. So it's possible that there could be more emphasis, but I don't see the FDA pathway, which I think is a more safe and guarded pathway for access, changing in any substantial way. Others might have other opinions or thoughts.
Other thoughts?
No, I don't see sponsors becoming more comfortable with right to try. It is just a mechanism that makes them deeply uncomfortable for the lack of FDA involvement, the lack of IRB approval. It's frequently referred to as an irresponsible pathway.
Thank you. All right. As we talk about kind of the challenges of the patients being able to find out what's available, and we've talked a little bit about sponsors who may create expanded access programs and then not have anybody request to them. Do you see any role for technology platforms or third-party facilitators in helping to make these connections for patients who are trying to find expanded access opportunities, for expanded access programs that want patients to know that that's available?
Yeah, absolutely.
Lydia, you want to start?
You want me to start?
Sure.
I'll just throw in there. So, because I am, as a clinical lead as the chair of the clinical trial consortium, and the growing pipeline of investigational products, it is becoming a little bit more, we've done a lot of this kind of curating of information very manually. And it's been painstaking, and I've done it personally. I actually talked to another organization who said they did it manually and they could empathize with how difficult it is. And so I think utilizing platforms, and so what we're trying to employ, and I don't know if anyone else has any experience, is we are trying to figure out how to use AI to kind of comb through development programs and automate the updates so that we can kind of create a comprehensive global picture of what the preclinical development is in a specific disease area, and then also for the clinical trial databases to keep them updated. So if we're taking information out of clinicaltrials.gov and trying to make it digestible, but then also trying to make sure it's updated with the current locations, the active status or not active status, so that it's easier. Because I think that's also very frustrating for a lot of people living with a disease, trying to get excited about a program only for them to call and say it's no longer enrolling when it said active on the website. In the future, I really, and I think my oncology colleagues are a step ahead of this, but I'm hoping that this type of technology and automation can eventually be incorporated into clinical practices to try to see if we can do what's called like a matchmaking system, where if you've seen a provider and that you have characteristics and they match an active recruiting clinical trial, you'll get that information at that visit, because they can, my dream is to kind of click into the electronic health record, type it in, and then I get the information and I can give it straight to the patient, or it can be incorporated into their after visit summary. That would be a dream come true.
Thank you, Jinsey. Mary Elizabeth?
Yeah, just to expand upon that though, and also say, but at the heart of all of this, there has to be human oversight, because I think we've already seen so many disastrous examples of what happens when we just let the tech run rampant and we trust facts to AI. You know, Lindsay, I remember 10 years ago with you when going to an event and someone saying, we always make sure that our informed consent is really readable. We run it through Microsoft Word and make sure it's written on an 8th grade level. And that is not the way to communicate with people. And that's not the way to get good information, to just always make sure that there is oversight and that human eyes are still on whatever it is that we're doing. I'm all for making things as easy as possible. I think we all are. We all want to spend more time doing the work we really put our hearts and souls into. But that also means making sure that the eyes are still on whatever information we are putting out there, because it's so easy to get it wrong and it's so easy for it to run away from us.
Yeah, great points. We have a couple more questions that have come in, and we have about 9 minutes left, so I'm going to see if we can get through a couple more of these. One question that came in is, how could you work with a patient advocacy organization after an expanded access program has already been launched? Who wants to take that one? Claudia?
Yeah, it's my beat. I think you should work with a patient advocacy group before, obviously, and hopefully have some input from them on what would be adequate for that community, what considerations need to be in place. But even if you missed that boat and it's now after the fact, don't underestimate the possibility of things getting complicated. You know, sometimes someone might not qualify for the expanded access program and raise all sorts of issues and go to the media and create a big problem. And I think patient groups can be really helpful in clarifying things and being mediators in discussions that are difficult, particularly if they've been involved in developing these programs in the first place, but also in valuing, helping place value and distinction on the different data that are coming from the program, and help you with your strategy in terms of how does that influence what you're developing based on what you learn. But yes, it's patient groups early, often, and transparently always.
Thank you, Claudia. Mary Elizabeth?
Just one other point to that, and also beyond patient advocacy groups, because they tend to be very self-selecting communities. And I love the advocacy community. I'm in so many of them myself, and so many of them are full of people who look exactly like me. And I am very aware that advocacy groups tend to be people who have the time and the energy and the resources to be advocates. So it's really, really important.
And the health.
Yeah, and the health, right, exactly, and the mobility to be able to do it. So it's really important to also be looking at community hospitals, to be looking at the data of where there is the greatest need, because those are the communities that are not mobilized and they don't have advocacy groups.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think there is, I hate to use this term to apply to this, but there is a lot of survivorship bias in our advocacy structure, because it's the people who have the health to be able to be advocates, the people who have the resources and the privilege to be able to do that kind of work, that, as you've said before, like, get the most volume, get the most attention. Yep. So one last question that we're going to ask before we thank everyone for joining us today: where do you see the current efforts to increase awareness about compassionate use happening? Are there grassroots organizations that are doing education on this outside of CUPA, which, you know, does whatever CUPA can? Where else do you see this being talked about, so that people who are on those front lines of talking to patients who may be thinking about this as an option know that they can talk about those options with them? Who wants to take that one?
I think there's a lot more awareness than there used to be. Expanded access has existed since the 1970s, and it used to be a very arcane, kind of sphere where that not very many people knew about. I think there's been a lot more media coverage. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times the media will cover expanded access and call it right to try, although they're not actually occurring under the right to try pathway, but it's become a catch term. But I think the media has very much increased awareness. The listing on clinicaltrials.gov has increased awareness quite a bit of an ability to find programs. And I think people who are interested or want to know more about expanded access should go to the Reagan-Udall Expanded Access Navigator. Are those posted? Are you putting links up somewhere for this kind of information? But that's an
Yeah,
extreme.
Allison, that was a hint to throw that in the chat.
Right. I think, those are really good ways for people to become aware about it. I think at FDA, we had tried for many years, and I think CUPA is in the same boat now, of trying to extend educational programs. But until people need to know, it's not something that they tend to access. So it's very hard to proactively make people aware of the program unless they have a specific interest in it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, expanded access is there, but it's never going to be huge or right for every patient. So it is really hard to say that every patient-facing person needs to know all about the system when it may come up so infrequently for them. So we are just about at the end of our time. I want to take a moment to thank all of our experts for their time and their contributions today. I also want to thank all of our audience for joining us today and for submitting such great questions to us both in advance and during our session today. CUPA is a volunteer organization. We are always grateful for the contributions of the CUPA members. But we are also grateful for your contributions. And if you are interested in making a donation to CUPA, there is information in the chat about how to do that. We also thank you for your interest in this topic that is so important for patients. If you are not already subscribed to the CUPA newsletter and you would like to receive updates, you can look at that link to the CUPA website that is in the chat, and that will take you to a place that you can sign up for the monthly newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you all have a great remainder of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.